Hello, everyone. We'll wait a moment or two for folks to trickle in, but feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, send where you're calling in from, and we will get started in just a minute. And I'll note that auto transcription is enabled, so you should be able to get live automatic captions. I'll also note that in the webinar chat, you can toggle between chatting just to the hosts and panelists, just us, or to everyone. So just note that. And we can go ahead and get started with a bit of an introduction, and then I'll hand it over to our panelists today. But yeah. Welcome everyone to our deep dive webinar on the role of states in transmission reform, and kind of what are the different levers that states can pull in terms of regional transmission planning, in terms of state-specific policy levers and agency action and things like that. And yeah, we can move to the next slide. Bit of an introduction. So my name is Kristen Soares. My pronouns are she, they. I'm the State Climate Policy Network Manager here at Climate Exchange. I'll send a link in the chat if it's your first time to learn more about the work that we do. We can go to the next slide. If it's your first time joining us, Climate Exchange is a national organization focused on passing effective and equitable climate policy at the state level. And the State Climate Policy Network, or the SCPN, is one of our main national programs to support that state work. We're a network of over 15,000 advocates, legislators, researchers, government officials, basically all sorts of folks working in and around state level climate policy. I just sent the link to the SCPN in the chat. If it's your first time engaging, you can see the other types of events that we host, recordings and recap articles from past webinars, through all of our events, including we also have monthly national calls where SCPN members will share state climate policy updates. The next one is next week. But through all of these offerings, they're all free. They're all rooted in really kind of convening and connecting state actors working on similar issues. And we really kind of hope to create a space to learn from the vast lessons learned and expertise held in the national network of folks working on climate policy. Today, we're focused specifically on transmission and the role of states. You can reach out to me at kristen@climateexchange.org if you have any questions, or if you'd like to learn more about what we do. On the next slide, just a little more into how we can support your work. Or we can connect you to someone who can. We specialize in tracking and analyzing state climate policy, climate mitigation policy, that is, as well as providing connections with experts, advocates, or other actors working on similar issues to you. We can provide example states for climate policies, state landscape analyses, and more. And again, all of our services are free. If you're looking for pro bono policy assistance or connecting with folks working on similar issues, feel free to let us know. And then we also host the state climate policy dashboard, where we track over 60 types of different state level climate policy and example policy text, best practices, things like that. Next slide. Last brief intro slide is just where we're currently running our largest annual fundraiser, which helps keep all of our offerings, including these webinars, free and open to everyone. I'll send the link in the chat, but we do an annual electric vehicle raffle where we will pay for everything you need in terms of buying and securing an entirely new electric vehicle of your choice. And then winners 2 through 5 also get cash prizes. So I'll just mention that. We can move on to our next slide and get into our call. So today we've invited an amazing panel of speakers to talk about really what states need to know about transmission, the different levers you all can pull as state actors, as various types of stakeholders. And before I get into an introduction of our speakers, just want to note, feel free to use the chat box as a space for connection, showing resources, anything like that. But if you have any topic related questions for the panelists, please submit those at any time through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you submit questions through the regular chat, they might get lost, but if you put those in the Q&A, we'll try to get to those at the end. And then also this webinar is being recorded, so if you have to hop off at any point or you know someone who wanted to make it but couldn't, don't worry, we'll be sharing the recording and slides as well as a recap article by the end of the week. So now we can get into discussion. This is our second event in our sort of intro to transmission series, where we're kind of working to educate climate actors on the basics of transmission, what states can do, so we can really kind of come together and meet this challenge of meeting rising energy demand, of getting to clean energy targets, keeping our grid reliable, and all of those wonderful things. And yeah, we have two amazing speakers today. Anjali Patel, who is from David Gardiner and Associates, will be talking a bit about state policies to advance transmission and other kind of state levers that have to do with transmission planning, cost financing, all sorts of things. And then we'll hand it over to Miles Farmer, who's a clean energy policy consultant, to talk specifically about the role of states in regional transmission planning as it relates to FERC Order 1920 and 1920A, which I will let him discuss more about. And then, as I mentioned, we will start the Q&A portion using questions you all are submitting at the end. With that, we can go on to our next slide. So our first speaker is Anjali Patel. She's the Vice President for Clean Energy with David Gardiner and Associates, and she leads DGA's work to help Americans for a Clean Energy Grid expand long-distance transmission to support reliable, resilient, and more affordable energy. And so I will hand it over to you, Anjali. We can go to the next slide and take it away. Thanks so much for being here today.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Bryn, and the Climate Exchange for organizing this webinar and inviting me to speak. This is a really important topic and a timely topic, and really glad to join Miles today in talking about this issue. So for those of you who are not familiar with David Gardiner and Associates, we are, and I apologize in advance, I'm still overcoming a little bit of a lingering cough. So DGA is a strategic advisory firm that helps our clients develop and advance policies to advance decarbonization of some of the highest emitting sectors, including the energy, industrial, transportation, commercial, and building sectors. And our client, Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, is a nonprofit organization with a mission to advance the critical expansion, modernization, and integration of the high-capacity transmission grid in order to achieve greater security, reliability, affordability, and sustainability of electric power service in the U.S. ASEG is supported by diverse organizations and companies, including utilities, merchant transmission developers, generation developers, consumers, environmental groups, the labor industry, and manufacturing. So across the board, strong support, because transmission it's a bipartisan issue. It's an issue that cuts across all stakeholder sectors. It's needed for everyone. And part of the reason I'm speaking today is ASEG put out a report in September on state policies that can help support transmission modernization and expansion. My team at DGA were the primary authors of the report. So we'll get into that in just a minute, if you don't mind switching to the next slide. So first, I just wanted to, before we go into actual state policies, I wanted to start the discussion at a bit of a higher level, at the 10,000-foot level, about why should state actors care about transmission, why policies are needed. So transmission is referred to as a great enabler. It's a backbone, or the backbone of the electric grid. It's needed to move generation from the generation source to areas where it's consumed. And distributed generation, or generation that's co-located where the consumer is located or close to the consumer, it's extremely important and a necessary component of our electric grid. But if we rely only on distributed generation or local generation, it's incredibly expensive and it's not reliable. And there's three reasons for that, and which speak to why transmission is so important. One is that larger power sources generally produce cheaper electricity on a per megawatt hour basis than smaller generators. So if we're building only small generation, then we're doing it in the most expensive way possible. The second is that the best sites to locate some of these larger generators, whether it's wind and solar, when we're looking at the resource potential, Or in the case even of traditional resources where water was needed for cooling, you needed access to the fuel that was going to run the generator or areas to store waste. Those best sites are often not right where the consumers are. They're in another location. So you need transmission to move the electrons from the generating resource to where the consumer is. And then the third big reason is that for the electric system to remain reliable, we must have enough generation to both meet the highest amount of power on any given day of the year, plus some additional resources for insurance in case a generator goes down or there's a need for additional power because it's extreme heat snap or cold snap. So when utilities pool their resources, they can collectively meet these resource needs in a much cheaper and more reliable manner. Their peak times may differ. So one system may have a peak in January because they're a cold area, and one system might have a peak in July because they're a hot area. They combine them, they may not need as many resources, where if one had to build it for all of their peak and one had to build it for all their peak, it gets very expensive. Similarly, it's the resource sharing is both for resource adequacy, making sure you have enough generation on your system, as well as to protect against extreme weather conditions. Winter storm Uri and Elliott are two of the prime examples of how weather systems can take generation, take power systems down, and how transmission can save the day, especially because power flows both ways. So during Uri, it was an extremely large storm. The areas of the Midwest, which were able to import power, kept their lights on, whereas Texas which actually has big reserve margins within the state, they had blackouts, multi-day blackouts, which led to significant loss of and devastating loss of human life because they could not get power into their state. They didn't have the connections with other areas. And in Elliott, which was the opposite end, there was rolling blackouts in the Southeast because they couldn't import enough power. A report by Grid Strategies and ACOR, American Council on Renewable Energy, found that a 1 gigawatt transmission line, so we're not even talking about multiple lines, one line connecting Texas to part of the Southeast would have provided nearly $95 million in value during Winter Storm Elliott to the Southeast, where Texas could have exported its extra power up, and then that, in addition to nearly $1 billion in value during Uri, where the northern states could have exported their power down to Texas. So to put just one more set of dollars on this issue, DOE recently released its planning study, and in there it says that transmission regions, when they're coordinated to achieve resource adequacy, system costs through 2050 are lowered by 170 to $380 billion. So this is significant amounts of money if we are planning more both between regions, between states, and then in the larger pattern between regions, which I know Miles is going to go over regions a bit during his talk. Next slide, please. So while transmission is important, unfortunately, the network that we have today is not robust enough to meet our near-term, let alone our long-term needs. At the core of this issue is really the idea that electricity is an essential service. It underpins all of our modern life, from education to health to how our government runs, fire, power, anything you can think of ties back to electricity, and therefore it must be reliable and affordable. We need lights to turn on reliably at all times. When we don't, that leads to both business losses and human loss in really extreme cases. And we need it to be affordable because people have to be able to pay their bills to keep their lights on. Unfortunately, our network is aging, so most of the transmission infrastructure that is currently in use was built in the 50s and 60s with a 50-year lifespan. In addition to that, our generation infrastructure is aging. The chart on the right is a chart of the in-service dates of conventional steam coal plants in the US. The vast majority of them were built before 1990 and even beyond that. So we're looking at 40, 50, 60-year assets that are still running, but not economically efficiently, nor efficiently for our environment. So we need to add new generation onto the system to replace that which is retiring, and we need to have transmission infrastructure to move that power. We're also seeing unprecedented load growth, which especially in the areas of data centers and onshore manufacturing. So in some states, this load growth is double or triple what their current usage is. So this isn't just little small increments, it's huge increments. And we've had over the last 20 years before that, we've had pretty flat demand. And so we're going from an era of flat demand to high increases, and we need transmission quickly, which is just, it's not being built, let alone being built quickly. Increasing extreme weather and wildfire events, again, as we went over earlier, you want a transmission network that's bigger than any weather pattern. There is investment in transmission, but it tends to be on the more local level and replacing the older infrastructure instead of thinking about high capacity transmission needs that will bolster and build out our backbone network. And then the last point I wanted to make of why we needed transmission expansion is that the full capacity of our existing grid hasn't been unlocked yet. So traditionally, transmission is run at a static level to be safe, because if you run it too high, you can spark a wildfire. But that's on certain days. So there are other days where you could run it, unlock more capacity. We're not doing that because we don't have the infrastructure or software on the system yet to be able to do that. And we'll go into that in a little bit, but modernizing the grid is equally as important as expanding the grid. Next slide, please. So when we talk about how much transmission do we need, experts have varying estimates on this, but the vast majority say a lot, a lot is needed. These two charts are from DOE's transmission needs study and its policy planning study, transmission planning study. I know that's a little hard to see, but the vast majority of every region needs transmission, but especially when you talk about the middle part of the country, because those are the key connections to other areas. So those middle parts of the country are how we can get power to move from location to location during those extreme weather events, during times where we're setting our resource adequacy requirements and developing the grid in the most flexible, reliable manner possible. So the chart on the left is anticipated regional needs, with the purple areas being high load and clean energy growth scenarios, and the green being moderate load and clean energy growth scenarios. So it gives you a little bit of a range of how much transmission we're looking at. The map on and the chart, the map on the top right corresponds with the chart on the left. The map on the bottom is from the National Planning Study, which shows you the layout of some of the lines that DOE is thinking are going to be needed, the high capacity lines that will help build out the grid. Next slide, please. So when we talk about states, transmission's tricky because it's not as straightforward as other infrastructure is. There's a sense of cooperative federalism here that comes out of the Federal Power Act, which says that the federal government has jurisdictional authority over the transmission of electric energy in interstate commerce and the sale of energy at wholesale and interstate commerce. But all other matters that are not covered by that statement are subject to the regulation by the states. If that's not clear, that's because it's not a very clear line. There are clear areas in it, but there's a lot of blurriness to it, which I won't get into right now. But there's a role for the federal government, which Miles is going to cover a fair amount of, and then there's also a role for states. States are not, they need to be partners in this area because they have important roles to play, especially when it comes to siting and permitting of lines, encouraging better planning, promoting benefits of transmission. There's a whole bunch of things that states can do to be impactful in this area. I'm not going to read through this whole list, but these are some of the goals of state policies and what we want state policies to be aimed at accomplishing in order to support transmission. So the paper that I mentioned earlier, there's a QR code to link to the report. We developed this report by talking to experts across the country on what do they see as the biggest roadblocks to transmission development, and where do they see some policy solutions from states? What are the most impactful policies? You could flip to the next slide, please. In this discussion, it came through that there are about six issue areas where states can act where there big barriers to transmission expansion modernization and where state policies would be helpful. So developing stronger planning processes, streamlining siting and permitting processes, and ensuring that communities have meaningful input into transmission siting. They look at addressing costs and financing, making sure their state agencies are resourced adequately, transmission modernization, like I mentioned, about the about grid enhancing technologies and advanced conductors, making sure we're using the most modern technology to optimize both our current grid and the grid we're building for the future, as well as what we set as like our last bucket of just things that didn't quite fit anywhere, but still play into supporting transmission modernization and expansion. These are things like workforce adequacy and governance and transparency principles. I'm going to go over real briefly. The report has a lot of information in it, and this third section of the report actually has statutory language, so I encourage you to pull it up and look at it. But I did want to cover just quickly a couple of the different policies that we pulled out in these buckets, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So under planning, the main issue with planning is that current planning processes are not meeting our current and future electric needs. They tend to be reactive, looking at what our past needs were, what were the past reliability violations, rather than proactive of what's coming in the future. Transmission assets are 40-year life, 40 to 50, sometimes 60-year life assets. We should be building for the entire period, not what happened yesterday. So there was three kind of big areas where experts said states could be helpful in planning. One is that they could support meaningful regional transmission planning processes, and I would add to that interregional planning processes, and support the use of best planning practices. So I'm not going to touch on this too much because I know we're covering that when we talk about FERC and Order 1920. Another area where they could be helpful is promoting the development of actionable long-term transmission plans, so that these plans could then feed into regional and interregional planning processes. We don't want islands because, again, islands are expensive and are not reliable or affordable, but we do want states to help support broader planning processes so that the inputs into the regional processes are as strong as possible. And in this area, there's a couple different ways that states could go about this. If your state has an integrated resource plan requirement, these are requirements that the utilities plan their generation needs. You should make sure that they also are planning transmission needs, because there's co-benefits to optimizing generation and transmission together. In Washington, for example, they updated their state IRP requirements in 2023 to include a 20-year forecast of regional generation and transmission capacity, and also look at the utilities' expected needs to develop new or expanded and upgraded existing transmission facilities. So they're taking a proactive look of what transmission is needed in the future. Michigan similarly requires utilities to file within their IRP plans, their integrated resource plans, an analysis of new or upgraded transmission options to meet their generation projections for 5, 10, 15 years in the future. They're looking more forward. In many states, they no longer have integrated resource plan requirements because they have moved from the vertically integrated model where a utility owns generation, transmission, distribution, to a competitive model where generation is sourced from the market and the utility only owns the transmission and or distribution lines. In those states, they still have found ways to support statewide transmission studies they identify energy resource zones and plan that with pair that with their transmission planning. So there's lots of ways to look at transmission plans, whether you have an IRP requirement or you don't. So in 2023, for example, Colorado's directed its electric transmission authority to study expanded transmission capacity across the state, including the ability to build new lines and ways to improve existing lines. So Colorado is looking at a statewide study. And then I don't have Texas on here, but Texas and Illinois both have developed energy resource zone plans that are paired with transmission needs. The last way that experts identified as needed to help support better planning is greater coordination between state agencies and their neighbors. So the Carolinas, for example, has the Carolina Transmission Planning Collaborative, where it's just getting kicked off. The new face of it is just getting kicked off, but they're developing a coordinated transmission plan for the areas of North and South Carolina served by the Duke Energy Carolinas, Duke Energy Progress, Electricities in North Carolina, and the North Carolina Electric Membership Corporation. So it's a strong planning across a broader region. Next slide, please. So siting and permitting policies, siting and permitting is often squarely within the state purview, although there is also federal permitting. And in some states, the states have declined to exercise their their permitting responsibilities, and have left it to the local government. So even in this, there's lots of different layers. The biggest recommendation was reduce duplications, decrease bureaucracy, make sure the environmental reviews are robust, but that they're moving faster. It can take years, and in some cases, it has taken over a decade, to site, permit, and construct a transmission line. When we're looking at rising load needs and aging infrastructure, we can't wait for 15 or 20 years for a line to be built and put in the ground. So one of the recommendations is to align federal and state permitting processes. Nevada does this really well. They require their commission to accept and incorporate findings of the federal environmental review process so that the state isn't conducting duplicative reviews with the federal government. There's also the idea of coordinating regional planning and coordinating siting and permitting within the state. So New York, for example, has consolidated all of its transmission siting authority into a one-stop shop. They do provide opportunities for local governments where proposed transmission facilities may be located to contribute to the discussion, to provide input, but they've preempted local authority. So not every local government is reviewing the application fully, and a developer doesn't have to go to every local government to get permission to build a line. There's the other issue along with siting, with the permitting piece, is that siting can be complicated. These are real facilities that go onto property and people can see them and they impact land. Of course, we all need to keep our lights on, which means we need the transmission that has to be sited somewhere. So in order to be respectful of impacted communities, early and collaborative engagement is highly recommended, including as well as looking at ways to reduce land impacts by using existing right-of-ways. So Wisconsin, for example, has laws that do both of these things. They have a law that establishes an explicit prioritization of corridors for siting new transmission in existing utility, and they have the order is existing utility corridors, highway and railroad corridors, recreational trails, if they can go underground, and then new corridors. So you're really looking at where land is already in use before you're starting to put it on green space. They also have a law that provides compensation to the towns or municipalities that host transmission projects. So the transmission owners pay an annual impact fee, and that impact fee is then distributed among the counties and municipalities that host the transmission line. ASEC has put out two reports pretty recently. One's called the Pace of Trust. The other one is recommended siting practices for electric transmission developers. And these go into a lot more information about collaborative, meaningful engagement, how to go about it, tips and tricks on these issues. Next slide, please. The cost and financing, building transmission is not free, nor is it cheap. Its infrastructure is capital intensive, and those costs ultimately are borne by customers. So the more states can do to work to lower the financial burden, make it equitable, the better off it'll be, the less litigation that we'll have. So that states are engaging in discussions on the allocation of the cost of projects. And I'm not going to get into that because I know Miles is, but that's a big area where state actors should be engaging productively and figuring out ways to make sure that the broad benefits of transmission are considered, and so that the costs are distributed equitably among beneficiaries. The other big way that states could get engaged in costs and financing is helping to leverage public funding, providing public funding or leveraging public-private financing opportunities to reduce the overall cost. So New Mexico, for example, their Renewable Energy Transmission Authority can provide financing for transmission projects it deems necessary to meet the state goals. The North Dakota Transmission Authority similarly has authority to provide bond financing for transmission projects to foster in-state energy. Um, the the other big piece that is not states, but states can encourage the use of, is the Department of Energy has a number of loans and grants that are supporting, at least right now, that are supporting transmission development. And they have a great chart on their website about the grants that they've already awarded going to really good projects. And so that's another area where state actors can help encourage their utilities, their regional planners and others to look at how to ways to reduce the overall capital costs to consumers. Next slide, please. State agencies are often stretched thin. There's a lot on their plate. So this was a big area where experts said that the more support that state agencies can get to engage productively in transmission planning and siting and development, the less bureaucracy there will be, and the faster projects will be processed. So a couple different suggestions in this under this bucket. One is enhancing staffing and technical resources available to state agencies, and coordinating transmission related education between the state agencies so that you're speaking the same language, that you know what other agencies within the state are considering. We mentioned earlier, New York had the Rapid Act, which created that one-stop shop for transmission siting that also reduced the duplicativeness between different agencies dealing with the same issue. Coordination in Delaware, a state legislator has convened a voluntary standing working group of state agencies and other interested parties to talk about what's happening with respect to energy issues in the state. And that's helped streamline thinking among the state agencies and enhance coordination. Nevada also has a regional transmission coordination task force where they advise policymakers on needed changes to site transmission facilities to achieve the state's clean energy and economic development goals. And they bring together a wide set of stakeholders in that regard. And then so those are states where they're using the existing resources. Some states have created brand new authorities where they consolidated transmission support and decision making into a transmission authority. Colorado, New Mexico, North Dakota are three prime examples of this, where their specific functions vary, but often they have opportunities to provide financing, as we discussed earlier, to help with planning, to coordinate siting, to look at projects that are needed. And then the last, again, Department of Energy has a lot of money to support state agencies and has really been rolling out their state technical assistance program. So that's another great place to look to enhance the effectiveness of state agencies. So next slide, please. I'm gonna kind of skip over the last one because that's workforce. It's very important, workforce adequacy and governance, but given the time, I just wanted to cover this one for a bit. Transmission modernization and GETS policies. Like I said earlier, the capacity of the current grid is often not optimized, and we really need to have policies in place that use the most modern technologies. If just as a reference point, the traditional conductors that are used on transmission lines wasn't invented in the early 1900s. So this technology has been around for a very, very, very long time. And we really do need to be looking at how can we use technology better to get the biggest bang for our buck out of projects. So we had a couple different recommendations on policies that can help in this regard. The point that I wanted to call to everybody's attention out of all these policies, the thing that was widely agreed upon is to make sure that the policies with respect to advanced transmission technologies and grid enhancing technologies, that they include performance criteria, because even some of the technologies that fall under this bucket were developed in the 80s and 90s, and there's newer technology available. So to make sure that if you're putting out state policies and regarding these issues that you're looking at, is it actually providing additional capacity instead of just like, does it fit the name? And then next slide, please. This is the bucket that I will skip for now. I'm happy to answer questions on this, and thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much, Anjali. That was a ton of information in a short amount of time, so I really appreciate your succinct explanations. And maybe feel free to send a link to the state policies report in the chat so that folks can see that and review more for later. As she mentioned, there's some statutory language in there, so can be very useful for some of you who are maybe more in the practitioner space of this. But all right, thank you so much. We can move to the next slide. Our next presenter, Miles Farmer, is an independent consultant and attorney focused on energy policy, strategy, and law. And Miles, relevant to today's presentation, Miles previously worked as a legal advisor to Commissioner Allison Clements of FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where he led her office's engagement in negotiating order number 1920, which he will be getting into. But so we have our ideas of a bunch of state levers and policies, ways that states hold power in transmission modernization and expansion. And now we're going to turn it over to Miles for more insight into states' role in regional transmission planning. And so thank you for being here. I'll hand it over to you, Miles.
Thank you so much, Kristen, and thank you to the Climate Exchange for putting this on. And thanks, Anjali, for walking us through all of the ins and outs of state policy with regard to transmission. And I'll flag for the state advocates and policymakers, that is where I got my start in energy. I was first as an advocate at NRDC, and then I was on the governor's energy team in New York. So worked on a number of those policies that Anjali was mentioning. But for this presentation, I'm going to get into the weeds of regional transmission planning as regulated by FERC, and specifically long-term regional transmission planning under this process that was set forth under Order number 1920. I'll flag my presentation here is designed to be kind of like a take-home that you can refer to. So it'll go quite a bit into the weeds, and you may see me skimming over that, but certainly feel free to reach out to me with any follow-up questions. And I'll also flag, I'm working specifically on compliance with this order, not the ongoing kind of proceeding around the rulemaking itself, kind of consistent with my professional responsibility requirements. So I'm not going to get into any of the ins and outs of kind of litigation or things that are ongoing in that proceeding. Next slide, please. So first, just grounding us what we're talking about with regional transmission planning. There's already a regional transmission planning process that's set up by FERC under something called Order number 1000. And what you see there is the map of different transmission planning regions that have emerged. When FERC sets forth its requirements on transmission providers to do regional transmission planning, it left it up to them for how to organize amongst themselves into regions. And Order number 1920 took that same approach. So in theory, these maps could shift if the kind of relevant transmission providers, the utilities essentially that own the transmission lines, decided to plan on a different basis. But I think everybody expects, and there are kind of ongoing processes for compliance that have been set up, that the map will follow this same structure. So specifically kind of in the RTO regions, it's the RTO that largely is doing that regional planning. And then in the non-RTO regions, the transmission providers have come together to kind of form these regions. So that's Northern Grid in kind of the Northwest, West Connect in the kind of Central and Southwest, SURTEP, FRCC in the Southeast. So, and these could shift a little bit. One other flag with this map is that you'll see there's a couple of areas that aren't quite the same solid color. Those are non-jurisdictional transmission providers. So like in Oregon and Washington, the Bonneville Power Administration. FERC does not have jurisdiction to order the Bonneville Power Administration how to conduct its planning. So to the extent that those entities decide to participate in this process, it has to be voluntary. So you could have kind of holes in the map, or if they opt in, then they would be included in the planning process. Next slide. So just to give a high-level overview of what Order Number 1920 and long-term regional transmission planning is. The core pillars of it are a forward-looking scenario-based planning process based on a range of different factors that are expected to influence future transmission needs, looking at a horizon of 20 years and evaluating a minimum set of benefits, and then aiming to evaluate transmission needs and select projects so as to maximize benefits, accounting for costs over time without overbuilding. And then there's kind of a long bullet there on a somewhat complicated process for allocating costs. But kind of the key is that when these lines are planned on a regional basis and selected through that regional transmission planning process, the costs are allocated to customers across the region according to the method or process that is set up by the transmission providers. And Order Number 1920 is very unique amongst FERC rules. It's kind of path-breaking in that it gives the states this special role in considering kind of and providing input on how costs are going to be allocated. And I think a lot of that is reflective of the overlapping jurisdiction and cooperative federalism that Anjali was talking about. Kind of in reality, states are extremely important actors when it comes to transmission planning. They're the primary entities responsible for siting transmission. And I think that practice has shown that where states are not supportive of transmission infrastructure that's being built within their borders, it's not going to get built. And so the commission provided a process that really is designed to bring them to the table and have a shared exercise. Next slide. There are also a number of kind of specific features of the long-term planning process that's set forth under this FERC order. There are requirements for enhanced transparency in the local transmission process, as well as a right sizing provision that looks at opportunities where if a utility might otherwise just be planning to replace its infrastructure in kind, for example, with kind of a like-for-like replacement, but in fact, enhancing that infrastructure could meet the utility's need as well as the regional need. It provides a process whereby utilities can do that. They can get a right of first refusal over that infrastructure and have it be folded into the regional plan if it meets the requirements that are set forth for selecting regional infrastructure. Order 1920 also has a requirement, mandatory evaluation of certain grid enhancing technologies, or also called alternative transmission technologies that Anjali was covering earlier. And then there's a process for coordination between the interconnection and regional transmission planning processes. I will highlight that through all of this, while FERC set forth kind of guidelines for how selection criteria should take place, it does not actually mandate that projects be selected. So Order Number 1920 sets forth a process whereby the regions can identify what's needed, they can plan for it, and if they determine to do so, kind of move forward and select. But that's not something that FERC went so far as to require happen. Next slide. And so just some of the basics on kind of the process, how we got here, what the timing is, what this looks like. So order number 1920 was adopted in May 2024 via a 2-1 vote with then commissioner and now chair Christie dissenting. But it was then modified through order number 1920A, which was issued on a unanimous basis in November 2024, with then Commissioner Christie joining the majority. So the request for rehearing of that order remain pending, and there are processes in court. But kind of the key thing is that while all of that is happening, the order is effective. It is kind of, setting forth a process that the regions need to meet. That's not on pause pending all of those proceedings or something. Next slide. So this slide sets forth the compliance and implementation timeline. I'm not going to try to explain everything on there, but the kind of key facts are that the compliance timeline by which all of these regions are supposed to come in and say how they're going to do this regional long-term planning process is June of 2025. So they're working hard, that's right around the corner on a regulatory timeframe, getting something in. That said, there's kind of a variety of processes by which it could be extended. Order number 1920A allowed for kind of envisioned a 6-month extension to the process for states engaging on cost allocation. And we've also seen kind of a number of extension requests come in for individual regions that have been even longer than that. And then the key point of this slide is to show that even once you have that compliance, there can be a gap between that and when the planning actually kicks off. So the compliance is setting forth kind of the tariffs and rules for the utilities about how they're going to do all this, but actually complying and preparing a regional plan is something that takes time and will be implemented over a number of years after. And there's a very wide range for kind of how long that process could take. So order number 1920 says that the planning cycles should kind of move through and select projects if they're going to be selected within 3 years, and then kind of repeat that process once every 5 years at minimum. So this is kind of setting forth a cyclical process that could take place again and again for many years to come. But exactly when that kicks off could be very different timing in different regions, kind of depending on how they approach this. Next slide. And then this is a chart that was put together by Anjali's client, Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, that just shows the state engagement periods, these kind of processes that are happening, and I'll explain a little more about them later, to bring the states together around cost allocation. And this slide just shows like these processes, with a couple of exceptions in ISO New England and MISO, they're ongoing. They're happening now. They've kicked off. And so you may well kind of be involved in those yourselves, or that's kind of why you're seeing a flurry of activity, even though the compliance deadlines are later. Next slide. So what is the role of states in this process? Very important role across the board. I guess first off, once they do planning, the regions are going to be putting together scenarios based on all of these different factors affecting transmission needs. And they have to have a process that provides meaningful opportunity to provide timely input on those scenarios for all stakeholders, including states. But states have a special role. And particularly in order number 1920A, the commission stated that transmission providers should consult with states and rely on the relevant state in determining how to account for state-related factors when determining long-term scenarios. So if there are state laws that are influencing transmission needs, the commission recognized that the transmission provider should get the views from the states themselves on how those laws influence transmission needs. So that's a kind of particularly important role in the scenarios the states will play, although they're not restricted to commenting on just the state laws. Also, in the evaluation and selection process, transmission providers are required to consult with and seek support from the relevant state entities regarding that evaluation process, including the selection criteria. So again, they're kind of specifically called out and looked to for input. There is a voluntary funding process within Order Number 1920, where transmission providers are required to offer relevant state entities and interconnection opportunities an opportunity to voluntarily fund the cost or a portion of the cost of a facility where that facility wouldn't otherwise meet the selection criteria. So basically, imagine, for example, that the region had said infrastructure needs to meet at least a 1.25 benefit cost ratio to get selected when we run this process. And they did a planning process, and they showed that a certain line that was critical for meeting the policy needs of a given state, maybe bringing in offshore wind, et cetera, it didn't quite get there. It was at 1 in the BCA ratio. It could offer the state an opportunity to make up the difference such that the line could get selected, and transmission providers need to set up a process by which that can happen, that the states obviously have an interest in engaging on what that process looks like, what the relevant kind of agreements could look like for providing that funding. And then on cost allocation, states have a particularly special role that I can expand on a little bit. Next slide. I'm going to kind of just summarize the next, make one key point, because the next several slides, I'm looking at the clock. We're not going to have time to go through all of these, so you can have these as a take home. But I think the biggest thing is that for cost allocation, there's ex ante cost allocation. That's kind of like a specific method that needs to get written down in these regional tariffs for how costs are going to be apportioned by default. And then there's something called a state agreement process that can sit on top of that and can override the default if states agree to do so, basically. And for both of those things, transmission providers are required to provide an engagement period to the states to provide input on how they want to do it, how they want to have the ex ante look, how they want to have that state agreement process look. And if the states agree amongst the relevant state entities, which kind of there's a specific definition set forth, but largely it will be kind of these multi-state bodies that exist will form them, like the Organization of MISO States or OPSI, et cetera. But if they agree, then the transmission provider is required to file the method that the states agreed to, even if the transmission provider wants a different method. The transmission provider can file their own method too, and kind of get those both in before FERC to consider in how FERC is going to rule on compliance. And so they kind of have a direct say in what goes into that filing, what's included if they agree. And so there is an engagement period that's set forth. It's supposed to take 6 months, but they can request an additional 6 months for the transmission providers to facilitate a meaningful opportunity for the states to negotiate and kind of determine, are they going to be able to agree on an ex ante or state agreement process? And so all of those processes are ongoing. The states have a key role in that. And then, I have a couple of slides that you can review afterwards, just kind of showing how a lot of the other processes that Anjali was talking about, citing state level transmission planning, et cetera, in an ideal world, those will interact very seamlessly with the regional transmission planning process. And so it's important to keep the regional transmission planning process in mind as states design those state level regulatory regimes. So Kristen, maybe I'll just skip ahead to the Q&A slide. I know we're down to 5 minutes, but that'll at least allow a tiny bit of time.
Yeah, no worries at all. We can go ahead and stop screen sharing here. But thank you, Miles. That was definitely, again, a lot of information, and I appreciate you distilling kind of some of those high level takeaways. Everyone will be getting the slides after this, so you guys can review more of that as relevant to what you all are doing. We will jump right in to just a couple minutes of Q&A. So feel free to ask questions if you haven't already. And I'll also just note, again, this is being recorded. We'll send the recording, transcription, and recap article by email by the end of the week. And then I'll also launch a poll at the end of this webinar, so you can let me know if this was useful to you. I will start with a question, one of the questions Anjali just answered in the Q&A, but I'll ask about, there's a question here coming from your presentation, Miles, but either of you, if you have insights of examples of successful state agreement processes. Miles, you were just mentioning those in your presentation, but yeah, any thoughts there?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First off, like a state agreement process as it exists under Order 1920 has never been done before, because there's kind of specific requirements set forth under 1920, and we'll see how it goes. But Order number 1920 it sits in parallel to these other processes that are out there. I think one process that has gotten a fair amount of attention is called the state agreement approach in PJM. The state agreement approach is actually kind of a separate process outside of Order 1000 in the PJM tariff that states can activate where they agree on funding a project, they can get it done. And that has been used by New Jersey. And New Jersey did it in order to kind of issue a solicitation for certain transmission infrastructure related to its offshore wind goals that New Jersey funded. But that can kind of continue to sit in parallel with 1920, or states could agree to do something similar. And then I'll also flag that not kind of directly a formal process like this, but I think states generally being in alignment around a transmission portfolio has been at the heart of some of the most successful transmission planning exercises we've seen. So like in MISO, for example, they have issued a series of kind of portfolio transmission plans for MISO North, all the way just prior to when Order 1000 was adopted. And then there have been some more recent portfolios put out. And those portfolios, kind of generally speaking, have had the support from states across the region, but they haven't kind of come together for this sort of formalized process around cost sharing. Those have just been kind of done under an ex-ante cost share process.
I'll just add to that the MISO, one of the things that jump-started the MISO process was that the MISO governors spoke up and said, we agree transmission is important, and we agree that we should work together to build this. And I think that went a long way to helping support the development of collaborative lines. And MISO's now done, 2 tranches of lots of projects that are going to build out the backbone of the transmission system in that area. But it really did take some political willpower to support that, and that's part of what's needed, I think, in other regions. As Miles was saying earlier, the more vocal states can be about the importance of transmission and that they support it, the better off we'll all be.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of tangible levers states can pull, and then there's a lot of soft power that states have as well. And appreciate that. All right, we are at the end of our time. There was another question that Anjali answered around siting of wind or solar at retiring coal plants. If you want to peek at that, you can. And I just launched a poll just at the end of this event here to let us know how this event has been helpful to you. But thank you, both of you. Thank you, Anjali and Miles, for your time and for sharing your expertise with our network. Thanks to folks who tuned in today. As always, recap article, recording slides, all of those lovely things will be in your inboxes by the end of the week. I sent a link if you want to register for our monthly national SCPN call next week, where states will be connecting on recent climate policy developments. And yeah, thank you all. This is just one of many, many, many climate policy topics that states have a huge role to play in the coming years. And yeah, just want to underscore that we have a beautiful, huge national network of state climate policy actors and climate policy actors in general, and we have a lot of momentum and a lot of expertise in this and many other issues. So coming out of yesterday, there's still a lot of work to be done and a lot of solidarity and community to be had in our community. So thank you, everyone. I'll end it there. Have a good rest of your week, and hope you can carve out some time to ground yourself in the craziness that is post-inauguration world. So yeah, have a great rest of your day, everyone. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, but thank you. Bye-bye.